Affordable housing should not be cheap. Now you may well ask, if it's not cheap, how can it be affordable? Why are we even talking about affordability on a channel about the ecology of urban design? And how much affordable housing do we really need anyway? In this episode, we'll investigate the affordability of Culdesac Tempe, the new car-free U.S. neighborhood that I profiled on this channel a few weeks ago. We'll take a peek into Tesla Motor Company's secret master plan and visit 4 different cities with 4 completely different ways to make housing affordable. And for you developers, planners, policymakers, and interested citizens, I've got you covered. We'll provide a free download with all the details. Welcome to Edenicity, Best Practices for Sustainably Abundant Cities. The purpose of Edenicity is to end the mass extinction by reversing sprawl. Our main strategy is ecological urban design that brings together housing, transit, energy, and food in a way where the whole is more valuable than the sum of the parts. This makes it easier to compete in a world where people have choices, because it makes it more economical to offer greater convenience, amenity, health, and safety. Now, there have been some criticisms of Edenicity. On the one hand, that it has a Soviet housing vibe, a blocky, repetitive, gridded nature. And all I can say is it's just a lot easier to draw that way for someone who is a non-architect, and it's a lot easier to understand. Real landscapes are not perfectly flat, and all of those grids that you see in the Edenicity design will need to follow that topography and become very much more complicated as they follow the contours of the land. On the other hand, some viewers have noted that these days, green living is a little bit unaffordable. If you want to be in a nice walkable green neighborhood, you're going to pay a premium for that. And I agree. Right now, green is desirable and kind of rare. But if we're trying to end the mass extinction, whatever solutions we have must work for everyone or it fails ecologically. So the question naturally arises, when will it benefit everyone? And the answer is just as soon as policy prioritizes housing for everyone. A few weeks back, we toured Culdesac Tempe, the first car-free neighborhood in the United States in 70 years. The breakthrough in this case was the zoning, which has no resident parking. It's also multifamily, mixed-use development on a transit line. And a couple of the things that make it a little bit nicer for residents are that its design is climate appropriate and that it's also very high amenity. Now, this is a venture-backed development, and venture capital is a relatively high-risk endeavor, meaning that relatively few investments break even. Now, doing something as new as what Culdesac is doing is, by definition, risky. Therefore, without really intense government incentives, it must launch at a high price point to offset that risk. To understand how a new product can move into the mainstream, let's look at the Tesla Motors secret master plan from 2006. The idea was to build a sports car, use the money from that to build a more affordable car, and use that money to build an even more affordable car. Now, there were government incentives, but these low-emission incentives were not about making it affordable for everyone, but instead just leveling the playing field for low-emission vehicles competing against the very heavily subsidized gas-powered vehicles. The high-end vehicle, of course, was the Tesla Roadster, first released in 2008. With a re-release coming in 2026. This is the Model S, which sells for typically about $84,000 these days. And here's the most affordable offering to date, the Model 3, which sells for $43,000. The question is, who can afford this? Now, to qualify for an auto loan, payments need to be no more than 15% of income. The chart on the right shows 100 American households from lowest to highest income. 7% can afford the Roadster, 32% can afford a Model S, and 62% of households can afford a Model 3, but 38% can't afford a Tesla at all, at least not a new one. Let's apply a similar analysis to Culdesac. In this case, the formula is you need an income above 2.5 times rent, and on day one, 45% of U.S. households qualify to rent a 2-bedroom apartment in Culdesac, 64% a 1-bedroom, and 36% can't afford it at all. Now, how does this compare to market rate rentals? Well, I went on Zillow and got the current market rate for 1-bedrooms, which worked out to a number that was $300 less than Culdesac. But look at this, it's almost the same qualifying income, because everywhere else, the formula is 3 times income because they're assuming that you have a car. So it's almost the same. So if Culdesac's affordability is the same as the overall market in Tempe, I'd say that's actually doing pretty good for the very first product coming out of a venture-backed business. They're matching the market in its ability to supply housing. Now, I know some people are probably thinking, well, wait a minute. Why would I live in Culdesac when I could go somewhere with a parking place for $300 less? Well, The amenities, the community, the free annual Metro Pass, there's a lot of benefits that are rolled into Culdesac. And whether it's an attractive offer or not to you, it will be up to the market, up to people's preferences to determine if this is a winning combination. But the bottom line is that the market is not supplying 36% of U.S. households with affordable housing. I'm going to be pulling some of my data for the next few slides from the 2023 Out of Reach report by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. This is the number of hours that you need to work per week at minimum wage to afford a one-bedroom apartment in every county in the United States. By the way, the minimum wages in this chart refer not to the federal minimum wage, but to the local minimum wage. For example, in every city in California, the minimum wage is at least $15. But to afford a one-bedroom apartment in major cities in California, you would need to earn $40 an hour for one full-time job to qualify. The very lightest color blue on this map corresponds to 40 hours, and everything else is more than one income. All the major cities are nearly two incomes or more just to afford a one-bedroom apartment. And those two-income households are just one robbery, accident, illness, or pregnancy away from not being able to pay rent. Put another way, there's 49 million Americans who can't afford a one-bedroom apartment in the U.S. This includes more than half of the people working as cleaners, clerks and secretaries, cooks and servers, drivers and movers, health aides, and retail sales associates. According to the Out of Reach report, there's a housing shortage in the U.S. of 7 million affordable homes. How does that happen? Well, the average operating costs of a one-bedroom apartment in the U.S. is $520 a month. That's basically the break-even cost with 100% occupancy for a landlord. If you work that 3 times formula that we saw before, the wage to qualify for that is $9 an hour. The problem is that the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. And that's for people working in non-tipped positions. So here's the problem. We have millions of people who cannot afford to pay the rent that it takes to maintain an apartment. This leads to deferred maintenance. As you can see in this picture I snapped in a building in the neighborhood where I live in Columbus. And eventually, as places deteriorate and people move out, occupancy falls, even less money is available to maintain them, and places end up abandoned long before the last resident leaves. In Columbus, in just the last year, a 400-unit apartment building and a 350-unit townhouse development were condemned by the city as unlivable for exactly this reason. And this is happening all over the country. Now, there is federal housing assistance, of course, but there's only enough funding to help 1 out of 4 families. So the bottom line here is that there's a floor to how cheap a place can be. Now, it's natural to think that if funding is tight, maybe we can find ways to cut costs. But that's exactly the wrong way of thinking. Here's why. This is the Pruitt-Igoe low-income housing project in St. Louis, Missouri. It's a nearly 3,000-unit development built in the early 1950s. As is plainly visible in the image, cookie-cutter construction, economies of scale, and numerous other techniques were employed to keep costs down. But within months of the first residents moving in 1954, signs of poor maintenance, vandalism, and crime started to appear. The problems spiraled out of control. Anyone who could got out of there, and by 1972, less than 20 years after it was built, they began to demolish the whole project. This is what cheap gets you when it comes to affordable housing. It's not the answer. Okay then, what is? Back in 2021, I joined a virtual housing delegation sponsored by Hawaii State Senator and Housing Chair Stanley Chang. Along with 55 other delegates, I attended presentations by planners and developers from Singapore, Hong Kong, Vienna, and Houston. I ended up pulling my notes together into this book and made it available as an ebook, which you can download for free in the link in the description. And of course, while you're there, if you're enjoying the channel, please make sure you're subscribed and hit the like button to help the channel out. I really do appreciate your support. The first of our 4 cities was Singapore, a true rags to riches story. Now, if you've seen that movie Crazy Rich Asians, you may have been pretty amazed at the opulence on display in the movie. Now, that was of course a little bit over the top, but Singapore has done really well for itself, mainly because it has not been cheap with housing. Here's how. In 1960, when it was still a British Crown colony, its population had recently swelled to 1.5 million people, and it was terribly poor. People had about 1/6 the money to spend as Americans. 75% of them lived in squatter camps or shanty towns. When Singapore got its independence in 1965, the new government quickly made housing a human right and set about building public housing for everybody that it could. This policy paid off handsomely. Of course, at first, because they were so poor, the buildings were very modest, but as soon as they had the means, the government built ever more high amenity housing. These are all offered for sale on a 99-year lease. So you buy the lease and you can sell it after a minimum occupancy period of about 5 years. In 1968, the government also made it possible for people to use money from their Central Provident Fund account, which is sort of like Social Security plus health care plus now housing, to fund their down payment and their mortgage. This is an ownership model. Fast forward to 2021, and Singapore's population had basically tripled. The per capita GDP was now 165% of the US GDP, and home ownership was 90%, which compares very favorably to 65% in the United States. Now, as I mentioned, these apartments are both high amenity and available on the open market, which means that they tend to appreciate. In 2021, the median price of a new apartment in public housing in Singapore was $408,000. Is it affordable? Yes. 80% of the population lives in public housing, and 90% own their own homes. Is it cheap? Absolutely not. So Singapore illustrates that affordability and cheapness are not at all the same thing. In addition, Singapore illustrates that secure housing drives GDP. When you own a home and have the government behind you with that Central Provident Fund and other resources, you don't worry so much about being one incident away from homelessness, the way so many of us worry here in the United States. Our next city is Hong Kong, which has a population of 7.3 million. Now, this is a place that has been just battered by massive waves of immigration. At the end of the 1940s, its population tripled in 3 years. And for the following 50 years, its growth rate never fell below 1%. Compare that to the 0.8% that we have here in the US right now. Now, Hong Kong is a really interesting case, both from economic and an ecological perspective. They've maintained 75% of the land as green space, in part as a watershed reserve. To achieve that, of course, they've built up, but they've also reduced their car ownership to the lowest among any major city in the world. Not coincidentally, Hong Kong has the longest life expectancy. Now, as of 2021, there were still 200,000 people living in subdivided flats, which are apartments that have been divided into many, many small closets where people live. And the government's been working on that, as you can imagine. One of the tools that Hong Kong has used very effectively to maintain its really compact footprint and provide affordable housing is transit-oriented development, which I've discussed in this episode before. The basic pattern is that they layer a transit hub with a shopping mall over the top and luxury skyscrapers over the top of that. The very high land costs and taxes involved in building those luxury amenities then pay for the subsidized public housing in the mixed housing ring within a 400-meter walk-in zone around the transit hubs. From a financial standpoint, this is pure genius. It's market-driven, but it aligns the developer's profits with rising GDP. Now remember, as we learned from Singapore, secure housing is really good for GDP. That is to say, how much money people have to spend in the long run. The more waiters, the more secretaries, the more cooks, the more servers we can get into secure housing, the better it is for everybody. It grows the GDP. So for the developers, the extra cost of building those subsidized flats are quickly recovered by, of course, the prices they can charge for the luxury condos, as well as the train fares and the mall rents, which strongly track GDP. Another key to making this work is to build all of these systems at a high enough level of quality so that everyone uses them, especially the transit. Senator Chang tells the story of the chair of a major construction firm preferring to take public transit from the airport to his ultra-luxury flat in one of the transit hubs. And the way this worked was he just got on the train from the airport, took an escalator from the train station up to the mall, then got on an elevator right up to his apartment. It was so much more safe and convenient than waiting for stoplights and battling traffic. And it was affordable. He paid the same $1 fare that anyone else would pay for that ride. Okay, our next city is Houston, which in a typically American fashion approaches affordability through deregulation. Houston is the largest unzoned city in the United States. And lots of people have argued that that's helped it to keep its home prices low. And indeed, its prices are much lower than the average home prices in the United States. But they're not that different from many other cities that do have zoning in Texas. But deregulation has had one effect in Houston, which has not served it well at all, and that is sprawl, which has led to much higher transportation costs for most residents. What about the rental market in Houston? Well, as you can see from that Out of Reach study, there's no county in Texas where a full-time minimum wage income is enough to rent a one-bedroom apartment. And in most places, especially in cities like Houston, you need much more than one full-time income to rent a one-bedroom apartment. So it looks like deregulation has just not lived up to its promise. Our final city, Vienna, has been named the world's most livable city by the BBC, The Economist, Mercer, and numerous other organizations year after year. One of the things that sets it apart is that it has a 100-year history of treating housing as a public utility like roads. In Vienna, 62% of the population lives in social housing that's either constructed directly by the city in municipal housing or through developer competitions that are juried by the city. These work even though the profit is capped by law because the city will guarantee the loans and make sure that payment occurs on a schedule that works for developers. Social housing does have an income ceiling, but once you're in social housing, they don't kick you out when your income rises. And most people decide to stay because the quality of amenities is really good. I'll have a little bit more to say about Vienna in the next episode. But I think I've made my point that affordable housing should not be cheap. And we need to remember that in setting public policy because it's public policy that shapes markets, not the other way around. In the United States, our lack of strong housing policy has resulted in a 7 million home shortage. And we've also seen how cheap public housing has failed for at least 70 years. And Houston has shown that deregulation is inadequate to give us affordable housing. From Singapore, we saw that investing in public housing is a very powerful tool for raising GDP per capita, meaning how much money people have to spend. Hong Kong gave us a taste of ecological urban design by being 75% green and integrating housing with transit-oriented design. And in Vienna, we saw how high amenity social housing is stable, livable, and very desirable. These are things we need to keep in mind as we move toward design and urban policies that can end the mass extinction. We need to keep housing convenient and affordable for all. But as we saw, affordable does not mean cheap. We saw that there's many policies that work and some that don't. Deregulation, I'm looking at you. But none of this will work if we don't do one more thing, and that is plan and operate our cities so that there are no bad neighborhoods anywhere. Now, I know from conversations on this channel that this is a controversial topic that raises intense emotions, but it also speaks to our ecological moment because it gets to the heart of how we need to grow as a species. I'll talk all about that next time. You won't want to miss it, and I'll put it right here when it's ready. Take care, stay green, see you next time.